고무장갑 다 똑같다고? 아니, 러버랩은 달라. 내 손인 듯 하루 종일 편하게. 슬림한 두께로 낀 듯 안 낀 듯 가볍게. 튼튼하니까 걱정 없이. 두 가지 길이로 다양하게 쓰는 러버랩으로 만드는 편리한 일상. 껴보면 달라. 러버랩 고무장갑. 러버랩.
In our headlines on this Thursday, January 23rd, here in South Korea, President Yoon makes a second appearance at the Constitutional Court on this Thursday for his impeachment trial, during which former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun took the witness stand. Meanwhile, the South Korean economy grows 2% in 2024 as its expansion in the fourth quarter notes a 0.1% growth amid the political unrest triggered by the brief imposition of martial law on December 3rd. Over in Washington, D.C., new U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio hosts his counterparts of the Quad framework for talks which ends with a joint statement that visibly omits any mention of North Korea and its nuclear weapons ambitions. We started the Constitutional Court, where the fourth hearing into the impeachment case against President Yoon kicked off this afternoon, again in his presence. For more on this, Arirang's Oh Soo-young joins us live from the court. Soo-young, so what are the latest events there?
Good afternoon, Sunny. Yes, President Yoon, he appeared in front of court justices for the second time to attend his fourth impeachment trial hearing, where former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun attended. He was called in as the first of 8 witnesses to the trial. Now, Kim Yong-hyun, he is one of the key figures implicated in the planning and execution of the martial law on December 3rd, and now considered President Yoon's right-hand man. Kim has initially said that he would take responsibility for the chaos that ensued, and it seemed that his loyalty to the president remains intact, as he initially refused to answer questions by the National Assembly's impeachment panel, saying that his words were likely to be distorted. Now, he did change his mind after the short break, and as the session proceeded, the focus of the questions was on the legality of the martial law decree, with Kim insisting that Yoon had held a proper cabinet meeting beforehand, saying that a copy of the martial law declaration was distributed to cabinet members and that somebody had kept the minutes. Also, when asked if he had written the controversial note that the Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok received, instructing him to draft a budget for an emergency legislative body, Kim said that he had, and had handed it to an administrative staff member. Now, this came after President Yoon initially said he could not remember whether he or the Defense Minister had written the note, before recently denying that he had. There was also much attention on the martial law proclamation, which included a ban on political activities, one of the Assembly's grounds for impeaching Yoon. Now, the former Defense Minister said he had personally typed up the proclamation on his personal laptop, but couldn't seem to recall which software he'd been using when asked by the Assembly. Furthermore, on whether there was an order for military troops to storm the National Assembly on December 3rd and drag out Assembly members, Kim said the order had meant troop members inside the Assembly to avoid potential clashes. Now, with his testimony on Thursday, Kim more or less seems to be establishing the stance that the martial law was declared to uphold the constitutional order. This was an argument that the president team has been making, saying that the opposition-led parliament had been trying to impeach incumbent officials, thwart effective governance and cut down budgets vital to public safety and livelihoods. The National Assembly side, meanwhile, has continued to argue that Yoon's martial law declaration and the related decrees were unconstitutional and violated procedures, citing how cabinet members said they didn't agree with the martial law nor documented their approval.
Right, and going forward, Soo-young, the president will now be attending, I hear, all of the remaining 4 sessions.
That's right. The president's lawyers have said that, if possible, Yoon will be attending all future sessions, which have been scheduled until February 13th. And so far, his team has unsuccessfully filed appeals against his arrest. And as the president's his former colleagues, the major figures implicated in the suspected insurrection, have also been arrested. He is looking quite cornered when it comes to the criminal investigations against them. So by attending future hearings, President Yoon could emphasize his own narrative, and he might even directly ask questions to witnesses if necessary, as he did today. Also, he may be more determined to appear at the Constitutional Court as a means of further rallying his supporters, emboldened by the latest polls, which show growing numbers back the ruling party and his non-impeachment. On Thursday, the police deployed 54 riot police units, which consist of 3,500 officers, around the court to prepare for potential incidents. Approximately 160 police buses were stationed, forming physical walls around the Constitutional Court. About 200 people were gathered nearby, waving Korean and American flags and chanting for the president's release and for the court to drop the impeachment case. On the opposite side of the street, though, people were calling for his impeachment and for the president to be punished. The police formed tight lines to prevent possible clashes occurring between the opposing groups.
Right, I see. All right, Soo-young, thank you for the latest on the impeachment trial at the Constitutional Court. Meanwhile, staying with the president's political fate, the Corruption Investigation Office for high-ranking officials is transferring its investigation of the president to the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office. For more on this, I have our Kim Jung-shil standing by live at the prosecutor's office here in the capital city. Jung-shil, welcome. Let's begin with this latest development.
Yes, Sunny, the atmosphere here at the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office is rather quiet this afternoon, with the investigation into President Yoon officially transferred here as of today. The CIO formally requested the prosecution take over the case as of this morning. That took place 50 days after the declaration of martial law. Take a listen to a comment by a CIO official from this morning.
The CIO has today decided to request the prosecution of the suspect in accordance with Article 26, Section 1 of the CIO Act, and has referred the case to the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office.
The CIO deputy chief added that President Yoon's refusal to cooperate has stalled the investigation. During the first 10-hour questioning session on the day of his arrest, he remained silent and later declined further questioning, citing health and safety concerns. The CIO also faced repeated interference from the Presidential Security Service in attempts to seize key evidence, including the president's secret phone. Deputy Chief Lee explained that while the CIO has investigative authority, it lacks the power to press charges on the president, so the case was handed over earlier than planned, initially set for next Tuesday. Now, the investigation will now be handled by prosecutors in this office behind me.
Right. Jung-shil, what are the prospects regarding the president's cooperation with the investigation now that it has been handed over to the prosecutors?
Well, Sunny, it still remains uncertain, as there is a possibility that President Yoon will argue that the prosecution, too, does not have authority to pursue charges of insurrection, which under South Korean law is handled by the police. However, as no sitting president has ever been investigated by the police, and former presidents have been investigated by prosecutors because they have the authority to investigate related crimes such as abuse of power. Now, take a listen to a legal expert on this.
Technically, it's true that the power to investigate crimes of insurrection has been given to the police and the prosecution office, but the prosecution office retains the power to investigate any crimes that are related to crimes that they are investigating. The president is charged not only with, or potentially will be charged not only with the crime of insurrection, but also with abuse of office and several other crimes that are still within the power of the prosecution office to investigate.
With both arrest and detention warrants issued by the court, legal experts argue that there is significant, substantial evidence that proves President Yoon's involvement in this. That's all I have for this hour. Back to you, Sunny.
All right, Jung-shil, thank you for that coverage. That was our Kim Jung-shil reporting live from the prosecutor's office here in capital Seoul. Now, the Constitutional Court on Thursday ruled against an impeachment motion targeting Lee Jin-suk, the head of the nation's broadcast watchdog. Now, Lee, who had been suspended from duty as the chair of the Korean Communications Commission, returned to work after 174 days. Last year, the main opposition Democratic Party unilaterally passed an impeachment motion against her, claiming she had made important decisions with just one other member of the commission, as the 3 remaining commission seats were vacant. Out of the 8 justices at the Constitutional Court, 4 ruled in her favor, asserting that the number of incumbent members of the commission at the time does not render their decisions illegal. An impeachment requires 6 justices to support the case. Also, on the local political front, the head of the main opposition Democratic Party has placed national priority on recovery and growth. Speaking at a press conference earlier on this Thursday, Lee Jae-myung called for a pragmatic approach to tackling challenges, one that sets aside partisan politics. He also called for the creation of new growth engines by investing in AI robots. Separately, he condemned acting President Choi Sang-mok for failing to approve a special probe bill aimed at President Yoon. In other news, the South Korean economy marked a 2% annual growth last year, slightly below earlier projections. Our correspondent Lee Soo-jin reports.
South Korea's economy only showed modest growth in 2024. That's according to data from the Bank of Korea released on Thursday, which shows that the country's gross domestic product, a key indicator of economic growth, grew 2% on year in 2024. This was lower than both the central bank's November forecast of 2.2% and the government's forecast of 2.1%.
After our November forecast, political uncertainty in the country grew, and economic sentiment weakened, which then impacted private consumption. Construction investment also remained sluggish as orders remained weak.
In 2024, private consumption rose 1.1%, which was lower than the 1.8% increase of the year before, while construction investment entered into negative territory. But as exports saw a sharp rise, jumping to 6.9% from 3.9% in 2023, leading economic growth, while modest, to be higher than that of last year's 1.4% on solid exports, a rise after 3 straight years of decline. As for the fourth quarter, economic growth expanded only 0.1% on quarter and was also lower than the central bank's forecast. The central bank mainly attributed this to small growth in private and public spending, as well as negative growth in construction investment. This follows an on-quarter increase of 1.3% in the first quarter, negative growth of 0.2% in the second, and 0.1% in the third quarter. With last year's economic growth hovering below forecasts, there are rising concerns about South Korea's economic growth this year, fueled by factors such as U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs.
Korean economy has been dependent upon the international trade and the export to the United States. Multinational enterprise has promised to build a factory in the United States to avoid the tariff, but as long as they make use of some parts produced in China or other countries, they are still subject to the tariff.
The Bank of Korea Monday lowered this year's GDP growth forecast to as low as 1.6% and the government to 1.8% in its 2025 economic policy plans released early this month. 이수진, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, on the corporate front, SK hynix staged a stellar performance last year on the back of strong demand for AI memory. Our Ian has more.
SK hynix, the world's second-largest memory chip maker, has announced that it recorded its highest-ever revenue and operating profit in 2024, driven by the strong demand for high-bandwidth memory. The company said Thursday that its revenue surpassed 66 trillion Korean won, or around $46 billion, marking a 102% increase compared to the previous year. Operating profit turned positive, soaring to just over $16 billion. Last year's fourth quarter also saw a record-high operating profit of over $6 billion. SK hynix reported record revenue surpassing 2022 by over $14 billion, and its operating profit exceeded the 2018 peak. One expert says the first half of this year is expected to be very promising, noting Trump's AI initiative.
Given the new launch of Trump government, semiconductor industry in general and HBM in particular, there are a lot of good materials to push SK hynix stock price at the moment. So it is quite positive in the short-term based.
Meanwhile, LG Electronics achieved record high revenue in 2024, reaching approximately $61 billion, a 6.6% increase compared to the previous year. This growth was driven by strong performance in its core home appliance business and expanding automotive electronics sector, which has seen 9 years of consecutive growth. This marks the company's highest revenue in 2 years. However, both annual and quarterly operating profit declined, attributed to slower recovery in global consumer electronics demand and rising logistics costs. The company experienced an earnings shock in quarter 4, with operating profit halving and falling more than 56% year-on-year to over $93 million. On the same day, Hyundai Motor also released last year's revenue data, reporting over 175 trillion Korean won, or more than $121 billion, which is up 7.7% on year, but operating profit declined 5.9% to around $9.7. Hyundai Motor's revenue for the fourth quarter of 2024 rose nearly 12% compared to the same period last year, driven by strong sales of high-value models, including hybrid and Genesis vehicles, which boosted the average selling price. However, quarter 4 operating profit fell 17% to almost $2 billion, impacted by higher incentives, external uncertainties, and a sharp rise in exchange rates. A Hyundai official stated that despite these challenges, the company continues to grow, supported by strong North American sales and increasing hybrid model sales. 이은희, Arirang News.
Samsung's Galaxy S25 series are out, and they're pledging to change the way individuals interact with their smartphones, thanks, of course, to AI. Our business correspondent Moon Hae-ryun explains.
Imagine a phone that knows what you need before you do. That's what Samsung's latest smartphones promise to make a reality. At its Unpacked conference on Wednesday in San Jose, California, Samsung Electronics announced its latest flagship Galaxy smartphones, the Galaxy S25 series. The Galaxy S25, S25 Plus, and S25 Ultra are all equipped with new AI tools unseen in their predecessors, unveiled as the firm's first AI smartphones a year ago. The new models will hit the shelves on February 7th in the same price range as the S24. They use Google's Gemini AI model alongside Samsung's in-house AI voice assistant Bixby and Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Elite chips for on-device processing, meaning that you don't have to be connected to the internet to be able to use AI functions. And these AI functions provide a key element in the S25 user experience: personalization.
With the S25, users can enjoy a seamless experience where the AI, agent and personalized AI features make life easier. Just say what you need, and the phone will recommend and handle it for you.
For example, Now Brief and Now Bar are new services that provide a morning feed catering to your personal preferences based on user data, as well as giving you updates throughout the day, such as giving you directions to your next meeting or giving you a breakdown of the latest sports games you've missed based on what teams you follow. And this is another reason why on-device processing is so crucial, because personal data used to tailor these functions will only be stored and processed on the phone. With many using mobile phones to search the web, Gemini's search tool enables users to look up information from their own images and even videos.
The new S25 also makes everyday interactions easier by simply being able to ask your phone to do things. Schedule the launch of the new S25 in my calendar. Schedule it for February 7th.
While the new AI features are the main focal point of the new phones, the hardware also boasts some upgrades. The new Ultra line has a 50-megapixel sensor on its ultra-wide rear camera in contrast to the S24's 12 megapixels for better quality images and videos, and also features a new, hardier screen. The series overall has rounded corners with a reduced bezel for bigger display, and there's an even thinner model to come called the Galaxy S25 Edge. This model was briefly previewed at the end of the Unpacked event, setting up competition in the skinny smartphone market, with Apple's ultra-thin model expected to come later this year. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
And over in Washington earlier this week, newly appointed U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio hosted his counterparts of the Quad framework for talks which ended with a joint statement that visibly omitted any mention of North Korea and its nuclear weapons ambitions. Our Lee Jae-myung has details.
The top diplomats of the United States, Australia, India, and Japan met in Washington for their first Quad foreign ministers meeting since the launch of the Donald Trump administration earlier this week. This meant that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was the first to be confirmed in Trump's new cabinet, was taking part in the meeting for the first time. However, the joint statement issued by the foreign ministers of the Quad nations saw the removal of any reference to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Instead, the top diplomats vowed to strengthen a free and open Indo-Pacific while opposing any unilateral actions that seek to change the status quo by force or coercion. It also did not mention China or North Korea by name. The latest joint statement is in stark contrast to the previous years, where the foreign ministers reaffirmed their commitment to the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The difference in the joint statement also comes as Trump and his defense chief nominee, Peter Hegseth, used the term nuclear power to describe North Korea. And according to a prominent U.S. expert and former officer at the U.S. National Intelligence Council, Sidney Saylor, the new U.S. administration believes Pyongyang's nuclear threat has evolved over the last 4 years, given the use of a term that was largely avoided by U.S. officials in the past. Saylor says the Trump administration faced the reality that the regime continues to grow its arsenal qualitatively and quantitatively, and the threat is greater than 4 years ago. He added that the remarks are a realistic view of the threat. While the term nuclear power is different from nuclear weapons state, a term used to describe countries like the US, Russia, and the UK, it raises concerns for South Korea, which seeks close policy coordination with Washington to achieve denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Lee Jae-myung, Arirang News.
And Foreign Minister Cho held talks on the phone with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio earlier this morning, during which the two top diplomats agreed to maintain close coordination in response to North Korea's nuclear weapons ambitions. According to the Foreign Ministry here, Minister Cho also shared hopes for greater advancements in the bilateral alliance under the new U.S. administration. Rubio, for his part, reportedly invited his Korean counterpart to the U.S. for more talks on cooperation. Both officials also highlighted the importance of the trilateral security partnership, including Japan.
The ultrafine dust has been a problem for 4 days. We passed the worst of the smoke yesterday, but the air quality in most parts of the country is still at a bad level. As a result, ultrafine dust advisories are still in place. However, from this afternoon, the air has been starting to clear. Ultrafine dust levels will gradually ease off tomorrow, except for some areas in central and western parts of the country. Meanwhile, there's rain or snow forecast for the East Coast areas between tomorrow night and Saturday to relieve the dryness. Until then, the atmosphere will stay very dry with dry weather advisories. Tomorrow's Seoul will start off at -2 degrees Celsius, Daejeon at -4 degrees. Highs will move up to 9 degrees in Seoul, Gwangju and Busan 13 degrees. The weather will be mostly sunny and warm in inland areas this weekend. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
Those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. We return with our panel session in a few minutes, so do stay with us.
How to survive in Korea. Cafes. Step 1. Find a seat. Before ordering, find a seat. Laptop, ID, smartphone, jacket, whatever that can mark your territory. But no bites. It's a little too big. Step 2. Pick up. We do not ask or call your name. We call out, B69번 고객님. The buzzer will vibrate when your order is ready at the counter. Wait, got your straw? Keep the top of the wrapper on. Doing this is more hygienic. Step 3. Cafe etiquette. If you need to use your laptop, find a seat next to a socket. No extra charge for using electricity. But if you're staying over 3 hours, how about ordering another drink or dessert? Step 4. Last bite standing. There's a mysterious custom in Korea. The last bite standing. When there's about 1 bite left of that cake, nobody will go for it. You might be tempted, but don't be hasty. Right before you get up, take the last piece, saying that you simply can't waste food, or just leave it. It will save a few calories. Did you survive at the cafe? Did someone behind the counter catch your eye? Go for the same drink every single day.
오늘도 아이스 말차 라떼 드실 거죠?
You might make an impression.
Step into a world where culture speaks beyond words, bridging hearts and minds. Hello, this is your DJ Sujung for Culture Crunch. Crunch on a new flavour of K-culture with me every day.
제가 사기꾼 같아요?
President Yoon Suk-yeol makes a second appearance at the Constitutional Court on this Thursday for his impeachment trial. On Press Perspective today, we continue our talk with members of the foreign media about the president's fate and more. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Press Perspective. It's Thursday, January 23rd here in Seoul, and I'm Min Sun-hee. While President Yoon Suk-yeol remains reluctant to cooperate in the investigation led by relevant officials, he appears quite dedicated to the impeachment case against him at the Constitutional Court. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with the news agency UPI. Thomas, it's great to have you back.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have freelance journalist Rafael Rashid with us. Rafael, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Thomas, we will start with you. Now, you've been covering the president's attendance at the impeachment trial over at the Constitutional Court. What has been the gist of your coverage thus far?
Yeah, just basically covering sort of what's happening inside and outside. I mean, inside I wasn't in the courtroom, but it's being broadcast live, and just you know, covering Yoon's, on Tuesday, covering Yoon's initial testimony, which was, you know, interesting. I mean, we're seeing what position he's taking in terms of the defense. And basically, you know, one of the big takeaways was he denied ordering the military to go in and pull the National Assembly members out during the martial law vote, which, you know, kind of contradicts claims that his chief of the Army Special Warfare Command made last month, saying that Yoon did tell him to, you know, break down the door and remove the lawmakers. And, you know, basically Yoon was saying that he had no real, you know, power to overcome the vote of the National Assembly. Was more framing it as this was an exercise or a way to send an alarm about what was going on in the government, the Democratic Party sort of gumming up the works and paralyzing the government. So this was sort of a way of sending a message more than saying, I really thought we were going to get away with it. That seems to be kind of the stance he's taking. That's sort of what the legal team is also emphasizing. And, you know, he also leaned in again to these allegations, unfounded allegations of election fraud, which, you know, as kind of being used as a justification for you know, declaring martial law. And that, you know, leads to the outside scene, which was the rally, you know, all around the Constitutional Court was a huge rally of his supporters, which we've been seeing for a couple of weeks now. And, you know, that's really the message that they've been amplifying, these charges of election fraud. We're seeing Stop the Steal signs, which are kind of being borrowed from the MAGA Trump movement. And, you know, it didn't get violent, but there is a sense of volatility there. There's a sense of hostility there. I mean, certainly people are in the faces of the police. I mean, there was a huge police presence, something like 4,000 officers, barricades all the way around. But, you know, it got tense, and there was definitely, you know, there's a real sense of anger that's growing. I mean, there were calls to execute Lee Jae-myung, with the opposition leader, and execute the chief prosecutor of the case. So there's a real, you know, a sense of volatility and hostility growing outside, and that's kind of the two tracks of what's happening with this whole impeachment saga right now.
Right, and before we delve further into that, Rafael, separately, anti-corruption investigators, they've had little success in questioning President Yoon over his abuse of power, which is why they earlier this morning announced a decision to hand over the investigation to prosecutors. Meanwhile, what has been the focus of the foreign media with regard to the ongoing investigation into insurrection charges against the president?
Yeah, I mean, let's look at what's been going on over the past few days. The CIO, the anti-corruption agency, their attempts to question President Yoon have been unsuccessful and have led to an unprecedented standoff. And after his arrest on January 15th, he underwent one initial questioning session, although, as I understand, he didn't reveal much within that session, and he has repeatedly refused to comply with the CIO. In recent days, they also tried their first attempt in South Korean history to forcibly summon him, basically going to the detention center, trying to question him. Again, that ended, you know, unsuccessfully. Yoon's team has maintained the CIO has no right to kind of investigate these insurrection charges, which has led to, as you said, the CIO referring the case to the prosecutors this morning. But I think international media themselves have largely focused on the broader implications rather than these day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute developments. The key points they're drawing attention to are, I think, the historic nature of Yoon's arrest, the first in history for a sitting president in this country, and of course the serious nature of the allegations of insurrection after the martial law declaration. So I think there's this particular interest in how South Korea's democratic institutions are handling this case. Of course, the investigation itself is centering on, again, whether he incited violence with the goal of subverting the constitution when he ordered the troops to storm into the National Assembly on that night on December 3rd. So I think now that the case is going to the prosecutors, there's going to be a bit more momentum or interest in international media, because I think this is a significant development. So we'll probably see a lot more interest over the coming days, if not weeks.
Right. Raphael, you covered the violence by rioters at the Seoul Western District Court in the very early hours of Sunday following the court's decision to formally extend the president's detention. Tell us a bit about your coverage.
Yeah, I mean, the scene outside the court at the weekend, I think, marked a disturbing escalation in this political crisis. About 90 protesters, mainly supporting President Yoon, they broke into the courthouse. Essentially, some of them were trying to hunt down the judge who had issued the warrant for Yoon's extended detention. They used fire extinguishers, steel pipes. They even used the police shields that they had grabbed from the police to try and break their way in, causing damage of an estimate 600 to 700 million won, which is about $500,000. The violence left around 50 police officers injured, some of them very seriously, and broadcast media were also attacked that day and had their equipment damaged. The police has formed a special investigation team to deal with this sternly, as they say, and among 90 people that were apprehended on the day, there have been around 50 arrest warrants that have been issued by a court, and many of these are actually young people in their 20s and 30s who were arrested on the day, some of them YouTubers showing their way around in the courthouse. I think what's maybe quite notable at the moment, as we're getting more updates over the past few days, is how some of these people involved were from far-right religious groups. One of the suspects that tried to go hunt down the judge was reportedly identified as a special evangelist from a controversial far-right religious group, and we've seen civil society groups that have filed criminal complaints against the leader of this controversial church, saying that he is the reason for the violence and he incited it. So I think over the coming days, many questions will be asked about where did this violence come from, this riot? Was it out of the blue or was it incited? And I think there are many parallels to be drawn with this case, this riot, and what we saw in the US 4 years ago on January 6th when there was the riot at Capitol Hill.
Right, and that being said, Thomas, speaking as an American journalist, what are your takeaways with regard to the parallels being drawn, as Raphael mentioned, between the 2021 US Capitol riots and Sunday's riots by pro-Yoon supporters here in the country?
It's hard not to see the parallels, you know, just the optics of it, the mechanics of it, as Raphael described, you know, these angry mob of supporters supporting a president, storming into a government facility, attacking police, destroying property, you know, wandering the halls and chanting for someone to come out. And January 6th, they were chanting for Mike Pence, the vice president, Nancy Pelosi. And, you know, driven in large part by the same kind of online generated far-right conspiracies that animated a lot of the January 6 rioters. And, you know, we've already seen there's an affinity and affiliation for these groups of Yoon supporters and the MAGA movement in the U.S. So, I mean, there are definitely a lot of parallels, whether it was directly inspired. I mean, it's hard to say, but I think, you know, more than that, it's the acting president Che called this unimaginable in a democracy, but I think actually this has become very imaginable. And seeing January 6th, you know, it sort of has moved the window of what is possible or what is even conceivable. I mean, it was so shocking when that happened, and then somehow it becomes less and less so, and, you know, not to say normalized, but, you know, it becomes something that is conceivable. And I think that, you know, if it's not really sternly responded to quickly, you know, then it becomes something that just exists as a possibility that people might not have imagined before. So, you know, there's a lot of similarities. I mean, there's of course differences. The scale and the sort of function of what they were after in the U.S. They were trying to impede the legislative body, you know, whereas here it was impeding the justice system, you know, and it was obviously a smaller scale. But, you know, I think a big difference that we're seeing is that, you know, Yoon is already facing consequences for his martial law declaration, and, you know, he's in custody and he's facing trial. And, you know, Trump never did face the consequences of, you know, his involvement with you know, involvement in the January 6th riots. I mean, a lot of January 6th participants did end up getting arrested, but now we've seen they've actually you know, been pardoned by Trump. So, you know, there's a question of this accountability. Here, there's still an opportunity for accountability to you know, be imposed, whereas in the U.S. we've seen kind of you know, this you know, the opposite of that basically happening. So there's a difference and there's a possibility. I mean, we'll have to see how this ends up, but Korea does have a chance to send a message that, you know, this kind of behavior is not tolerable in a democracy.
Thomas, speaking about sending a message, as you mentioned, Mr. Trump earlier this week pardoned the January 6th rioters. What has been the response to that move?
I think it was expected, but the scope of it is kind of shocking, you know, because he pardoned everyone across the board. I mean, even a month ago, Trump had kind of been mentioning it and sort of, you know, seemed to carve out an exception for what, you know, what he called like the radical crazy ones. And Vice President Vance had said, you know, something like, of course, it would only be the people that protested peacefully, you know, not the violent ones. But Trump went ahead and pardoned, you know, it was almost 1,600. And so a lot of them, you know, were people that had been arrested for trespassing or damaging property. Some of them were just, you know, misdemeanor type of charges. But there was around 600 that were convicted of either assaulting or resisting or obstructing police. And among those, 175 roughly were charged with, you know, deadly violence or assault with dangerous weapons. And, you know, some of the, I mean, these were people assaulting policemen with fire extinguishers, flagpoles, using tasers, bear spray. So, you know, and a lot of them had significant prison terms, you know, 5 years, 10 years, and they were freed. And then Trump also commuted the sentences of a number of, they were mainly members of these militias like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, that had been convicted of seditious conspiracy, and some of them had very long sentences. Enrique Tarrio, who's the kind of head of one of the Proud Boys, had a 22-year sentence. Another head of the Oath Keepers had an 18-year sentence. So those were also, they weren't pardoned, but they were totally commuted. So I think, you know, amidst a whole range of sort of expected but shocking in how vast and dramatic the moves that Trump has been making in just the first couple of days. I mean, this was along those lines. So it was, you know, expected, but more than people I think had really anticipated.
Right. Meanwhile, back here in the country, Raphael, along with the concerns covered by the foreign media, given the country's political turmoil, quite a number of international media have also continued to commend the Korean people for protecting democracy. speaking within your capacity as a journalist based here, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, I think, of course, what happened on the night of December 3rd has been quite shocking for everyone involved. But a lot of foreign media have been commending the role of the Korean people in protecting democracy, and in a powerful analysis that was published in The Guardian just recently, an expert highlighted how South Korea's democratic institutions were preserved, and the remarkable resilience during this crisis. And when President Yoon declared martial law on December 3rd, the parliament worked very swiftly with nationwide support from the citizens who still carry traumatic memories of authoritarian regimes and governments of the past, and that kind of state of violence. And when I was outside the parliament on that day, what I did find remarkable was how quickly citizens were already there, well before the politicians arrived. And from my own reporting over the past a week and a half, speaking with lawmakers of the opposition party, I think one thing that they are emphasizing is how the citizens were there, and many lawmakers who had to go across the fences to go into the main hall of the National Assembly, they say that in order to get into the main hall, it was their staff and their secretaries that were waiting outside the doors, blocking it so that the military could not come in, and basically forming a human barricade in a way. And some of them say, looking back, that their staff, their secretaries, essentially risked their lives, put their lives on the line to protect the lawmakers inside in order for them to vote to nullify the martial law. So there was also another article in The Guardian. The editorial board actually published an article, and they added, of course, that South Korean presidencies have usually ended badly with leaders being assassinated, ousted, or impeached, but that the events demonstrated both the strengths and ongoing challenges of Korean democracy. And while the reluctance of Yoon's party, his colleagues in the People Power Party for initially backing they had a lot of reluctance to back the impeachment. The paper noted that underlying all of this remains a strong sense of democracy that Koreans feel within themselves. So I think what's clear is how institutions maintained restraint during this martial law crisis, during these tense times, and I think it speaks volumes about the democratic values that Korean people have embedded within themselves, and I think that spirit was definitely on show on the night, but also over the past few weeks up until today.
All right. Perhaps staying with what Raphael has just said, Thomas, the words of wisdom are democracy is a work in progress and not of progress. So do you suppose Korea is indeed witnessing these words in action as we speak?
Absolutely. I think all democracies sort of operate under that principle. Another phrase I've heard is democracy is a verb. This idea that it's not something you just kind of set and then it works on its own. You have to be active and participate. And, I think it is interesting to see how this is playing out in South Korea, which, is such a young democracy. And as Raphael mentioned, so many people have active memories of the struggle for democracy and what life under martial law was like. And, I think some of that era still carries over into today. I mean, the 1980s, a lot of powerful coalitions were formed of labor unions and student groups, and there still is that ability, I think, to mobilize very quickly. And we saw that, as Raphael mentioned, almost immediately at the night of the martial law decree, which was surprising to me too, how swiftly. And I think that is just something that's kind of embedded in the society and still exists from those days of the democracy struggle, these networks. And so that's been, fascinating to watch. And I think, as well, that it really is a question of the institutions, not just, democracy as in going to cast your ballot, but the independence of the judiciary, the media's ability to report freely. And, we have seen those hold for the most part, this time around, and seeing kind of a sense of accountability. I was going to say, we're talking about things that were imaginable before, seeing the January 6th rioters, but, something like, and this has happened in the past, the president, it's not great to keep impeaching presidents, throwing presidents in jail, but at the same time, it becomes something that is imaginable, is possible. People can envision a president being prosecuted, being held to account for corruption or doing things that are undermining the democracy. So I think that's something that is powerful that still exists in South Korean democracy. And sometimes, comparing it to the U.S., I feel like, we're seeing the U.S. going through a lot of struggles now. And just globally, I think democracy is kind of in a challenging period and backsliding in a lot of countries. So it's not just, the young democracies that are a work in progress. It really is something that has to be kind of reapproached and change. That's the strength of democracy too, is that it can adapt to changing circumstances. Even now with this case with Yoon, we're seeing something like the anti-corruption organization that's investigating him and recommending charges. They've only existed for 4 years, basically, so they're kind of a response to something that has happened in the past. So we're seeing, this evolution of Korean democracy, and, so far it has been, I think, a model of maintaining those values during a challenging time. We'll see how this all plays out, but there's definitely a lot to kind of take away from this.
Right, and as we wait for this to play out, Raphael, there are scholars here in the country who fear that the latest political unrest may negatively affect the country's credibility, reliability on the international stage. Do you suppose this is a valid concern?
Difficult question, but I think, initially the shock among even diplomatic circles here was palpable when a democratically elected president suddenly declares martial law. And I think that concern has probably deepened with the subsequent arrest under insurrection charges. So I think it's a valid concern that these events could maybe affect South Korea's credibility, though the impact of this largely depends on how the situation is going to be managed going forward over the next few weeks. Hopefully it won't drag on for too long. At the end of the day, South Korea has built an extremely strong reputation, not only in the world, but around the world as a thriving democracy and a reliable economic partner. So I think if things are not resolved, maybe investor confidence could waver, and credibility, diplomatic credibility could be affected. So there's also economic dimension. South Korea has an extremely important role in global technology supply chains. All that being said, South Korea has weathered political crises before, lest we forget 2017 when President Park Geun-hye was impeached, and at the time they said there was a lot of turmoil and what's going to happen to Korea. But I think overall South Korea did not suffer too much long-term damage because of that. So yes, there are concerns, but I think they are limited for the time being, and people are being cautious but also optimistic that the situation will hopefully be resolved quickly.
Right, fingers crossed for that. And on that cautious optimism, we'll end today. Raphael, as always, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you very much.
And Thomas, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we say goodbye for today. We return same time tomorrow, that is Friday, with a look at the broader social issues.